Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a bit of a exploration of another ancient society, a little bit of a flip through a book called the Popol Vuh. Some of you may know what this is. It is a text. It was essentially the Mayan Bible, written or discovered by the Quiche people of Guatemala in the classical period. So this text will be the foundation of our discussion today, that we will veer into a more comprehensive look at Mayan astronomy, particularly related to the planet Venus and the ways in which the planet Venus worked as a predictive power in Mayan spiritual practice. So that is the goal today. We're going to be doing a flip through of a few maps and pictures from the hieroglyphic pages of the Popol Vuh. And we'll talk about the origins of the Popol Vuh before moving into that astronomy. Because this is such a large text, this will be a multiple video series of soft-spoken explanations. So you can keep a lookout for some actual readings from the text coming down the line. Okay? Now, the Popol Vuh is also called, or it means council book. And this is because the text was used by council members to make important decisions, believing that this book could predict the future. And if one read it, and if one knew it, and if one did lengthy performances of it, you could gain sight to the limits of space and the limits of time. And this was based off of the creation myth that it describes, because it is a book, ultimately, that describes human creation. And it describes human creation as beginning with four people. The four humans, the four first humans that arrived, had the ability to speak the language of the gods, and most importantly, they had the sight of the gods, which means, again, they could see to the limits of space and the limits of time. They had that kind of omniscience, omnipotence that a god would have. Now, the gods, of course, would not want these people to have the capacity to become their equals. And so the gods took away their sight. They limited their sight to the sight that we currently have, in which we are limited entirely to the space in which we live. We cannot see into the future. We can see only the present and, to some extent, the past. But as we know, our version of the past is so limited and often obscure or plainly incorrect. Okay? So the nearsightedness or myopia that the gods placed on the people is something that the Popol Vuh attempts to overcome by saying that this is the language of the gods, and a performance of it, of which there would be performances, long performances of the entire text, could give you temporarily, in a kind of religious fervor, the sight that was taken from the first four humans. Okay, it could return you to a time in which time was not so linear, right? So that's why this text is so fascinating. And I do wonder, as I study it alongside you and I read it with you, if somehow we will be able to capture some of that prescience, or that ability to see into the future, from the auguries that are present throughout it. And auguries is a symbol or a thing that predicts the future. So this text is allegedly full of auguries that are derived in a large part from astronomical research. So I wonder if we will be able to see some or predict human behavior because of the text. It's not a completely unfounded claim that it could do so, because as we know, human behavior is highly predictable. And if someone studies very intensely the behaviors of ancient cultures, we can, to some extent, understand how our culture will act. And so that is, reason to study these ancient cultures. The fact that this text focuses so much on the overcoming of myopia, however, that's a word I've always struggled with, because I always think it's pronounced myopia, and it's not. So I'm gonna say nearsightedness, myopia, whatever you want. It's just one of those words that's gotten me forever. But we are going to focus on that because we, as a society, I think as an American society, I am American, I know I have international viewers, but as an American, one thing that we struggle with is that kind of myopia in our study of history. And we focus so often on cultures, or the same cultures. We focus on the Greek and the Roman. We read the Iliad, we read Homer, we read Virgil, we read all of these great texts, but we would neglect these texts. We neglect the history that is our own, right? We neglect the Aztec, we neglect the Mayan, we neglect the Comanche, we neglect the Navajo. These ancient cultures that are very much still present, because the Popol Vuh, the Quiche people, are in Guatemala today. They're still around, right? They still exist. And they still practice these kind of ancient ceremonies present in this text. And yet we completely ignore them. We don't learn about them. And it's almost as if we think they're barbaric and not worthy of study. And that's just a plainly wrong sentiment. So I'm hoping to take this channel to bring some farsightedness, to make a more diverse representation of ancient culture. So a preview, we're going to do this book for a few videos. I also want to do a video on Afghani ancient art, because Afghanistan is an extraordinary country when it comes to culture, and ancient culture in particular. So we will do a video about Afghani art accompanied with Afghani poetry. So that's coming down the line as well. So if that interests you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss those videos. All right. That being said, let us start with the history of how this text came to be. And we'll think a little bit again about its focus on predicting the future, and how such a thing could be possible from a book. And we'll talk about how Cortez found his way to it, how he limited Mayan culture, and how Mayans reacted to those limitations. Now, with a flip through of this beautiful book. And once we're done with that, we will transition into the astronomy sections of the text for today. Okay, lovely. Okay. Here we are with the first page, the title page of the Popol Vuh. We have here a drawing, a hieroglyphic drawing that might have been on a temple or some sort of architecture in Mayan civilization that might have eventually been translated into the Roman alphabet in the 1700s or 1800s in response to colonization, which is how the Popol Vuh came to us, and I'll get into that more detail of that later, but this is how the Popol Vuh originated before it was translated into our alphabet, originally into Spanish. So here is a hieroglyphic. I'm not sure what it represents, but I'm sure it has something to do with the dawn of life. Okay, so let's move on. We're going to go straight to this post-it note. No, sorry, a little bit before that post-it note, to this poem here, and this is how we're going to begin our reading. This here is a powerful recitation the daykeepers at public shrines would recite before the shrine itself. And it talks about undertaking a reading, which is interesting because we wouldn't think about reading as being a profound exercise. But if you can imagine that reading the Popol Vuh would give you the ability to see into the future, then yes, it would be a profound, profound reading, one that you would need a lot of preparation to undertake. So we shall read it ourselves as soon as I have some filter water. Okay, here we go. Make my guilt vanish, heart of sky, heart of earth. Do me a favor. Give me strength, give me courage, in my heart, in my head. Since you are my mountain and my plain, may there be no falsehood and no stain. And may this reading of the Popol Vuh come out as clear as dawn. And may the sifting of ancient times be complete in my heart, in my head, and make my guilt vanish, my grandmothers, grandfathers. And however many souls of the dead there may be, you who speak with the heart of sky and earth, may all of you together give strength to the reading I have undertaken. Interesting that I see here, and perhaps you noticed it as well, is this preoccupation with guilt, and one must be guiltless before reading this text. It's very similar to Christian theology, which does focus on the state of guilt that we all exist in due to original sin, and that there's a kind of criminality in being alive, a kind of dirtiness in being alive. So this guilt is intriguing, and I do wonder if to some level guilt is associated with myopia. I don't know, it's a weird kind of thesis, but if that guilt, that fear of oneself, or the feeling that oneself, maybe not guilt, but it's rather shame, feeling that one is profoundly wrong in some way, makes it impossible to see beyond oneself. So that's my thesis, I shall say, that the sense or preoccupation, I spelled that wrong, with one's flaws, or kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say sin, we'll just say flaws for now, makes one lose now I forgot what I said. Oh well, I don't have to write a thesis statement for this book. What am I doing? Nobody's telling me I have to do this. I can just stop. But anyway, a preoccupation with one's flaws, or the constant desire to purify oneself, kind of does stand in direct conflict with the goal, which is to be able to see past oneself, right? I don't know. I just think that perhaps it's just self-awareness, which kind of goes along with the idea of the Garden of Eden, that Adam and Eve gained a self-awareness, and that is what led them to their fall. But yeah, that self-awareness is so often centered in guilt. Why is that? Why is our self-awareness centered in guilt and shame and not in something different? I don't know. It's problematic, and I hope that because this incitation is encouraging one to vanish one's guilt, to disappear one's guilt, perhaps we will learn that in the coming pages. But that's how I kind of interpret that poem. I don't know how you guys interpret it. But here we go. This is the first image we'll look at, and it's a very important one because it's a map of the Mayan territories, and so this is the story of the Popol Vuh. You can see El Salvador here, so Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, and then Guatemala right above, and then Chiapas, and you have the different kind of departments of Mexico. So the Quiche people are the ones who started this whole thing, and they discovered pieces of the Popol Vuh while traveling from Quiche to the ocean, okay, Pacific Ocean. I think I said Atlantic before. I apologize. It's terrible. How embarrassing. But yes, traveling to the Pacific Ocean, and that is why, because it was discovered on that traveling, it is called, another name for it, the light. I don't know if you can see, the light that came from beside the sea. So in this case, the Popol Vuh is the light. And it did not come from the sea, but beside the sea, and that's an important distinction. So from beside the sea, somewhere here, was the light of knowledge discovered on a pilgrimage. Right here, that's where it happened. Okay. It was also called our place in the shadows. And that's because it spoke of a time, right, before the first true dawn. Okay. And this is what they call of a time when their ancestors hid themselves and the stones that contain the spirit familiars of their gods in forests. And I don't quite know why they were hiding themselves, so that is perhaps something that will be answered later. And it's also the dawn of life, which again goes to the fact that this is a creation book. Now this is some history of how we actually came to know what the Popol Vuh even is. And so this is very important information. And in it lies another paradox. We had initially the paradox of light and dark, as seen by even the name. The name itself of the text is paradoxical, and then we have our place in the shadows, but we also have the light that came from the sea. How is it the name can be both, right? How can it be both of the light and also of the shadows? And so we have a singular paradox arriving here in our relationship with the Popol Vuh, how we came to it, etc. Okay. So when Cortez arrived and discovered the Mayan civilization in the 16th century, these colonizers essentially made any sort of public expression illegal. And that meant any written expression. Now, in the Mayan civilization, written texts were quite popular. They were written on a kind of paper-like thing that was put together into these books. And so they found these books, but unfortunately they were burned in order to destroy Mayan culture and resistance, right? Resistance is really essential. So they established a monopoly on virtually all major forms of visible public expression. And that is when our written texts began to disappear. And these written texts were in hieroglyphics. They were both phonetic and symbolic, just like the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So across oceans, we see a similar writing style emerge, which suggests a kind of universality to the way that humans come to language. Outside of, when they don't even have any interactions. But anyway, that public expression was made illegal. Even some textiles and clothing were made illegal because of the settlers realized that the textiles of the Mayan people actually had writing in them. So there was that connection there. So in this destruction of culture, the Mayans learned to hide their own gods behind the Christian gods, much like the first four people hid their gods, godlike familiars, in stones. And so this practice of hiding behind the powerful symbols they were forced to adopt is one that goes back to their own founding myths. Right? They would hide their own gods behind the gods, the saints, or figures of Christian theology. And they would do the same for their hieroglyphics. They would translate their hieroglyphics. As you can see here, this is a representation of their hieroglyphic writing. They would translate them into the Roman alphabet that we know in order to protect them. And this particularly happened in the 17th century, as you can see here, and also the 18th century. It happened because there were so many ruins and things burned that in the ruins, people, Mayan spiritual guides or Mayan religious figures or people dedicated to preserving the religion of the Mayans would find these hieroglyphics in the ruins. And they would write them down in the Roman alphabet, essentially preserving that culture in a secret way. Okay. And so only 4 books, as I've spoken to before, survived, and they found their way to Madrid, Paris, Dresden, and another was found in Chiapas. And that makes up our knowledge of Mayan hieroglyphics, Mayan writing. So, the intriguing thing is the alphabetic writing that would preserve these texts is at the same time the thing that destroyed them. And so that comes again to that paradox I was speaking to, is that these colonial settlers were hell-bent on destruction, but also determined to preserve all that they destroyed. It's an intriguing impulse to preserve and destroy simultaneously, and it's a paradox to human behavior that is constant, I think, throughout time, and it's one that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this line here says exactly that. There was no little justice in the fact that it was the missionaries themselves, the burners of the ancient books, who first introduced Mayans to alphabetic writing. And it was actually a friar who ended up giving us the first translation of the Popol Vuh in Spanish. So it was these religious missionaries hell-bent on converting people that actually ended up preserving the faith at the same time. So it's creating artifacts of something, right? You take something, and once you turn it to stone, essentially, you take the thing and you mummify it. You've killed it. And I think that you've killed it, but you've also gotten a trophy of that murder, maybe as a way to look at that paradox. So, that being that, let's move on to the story of this Franciscan monk, or friar rather, Francisco Jimenez, right? Who made the Spanish translation, which was later published in 1857 by the Habsburg family in Vienna, which was ironic because it was the Habsburg family who was in control when the first contact with the Mayans was made in the 16th century. So there was that kind of maintenance of that lineage and that power structure all the way to 1857 in the publication of the Popol Vuh. Okay. It currently rests in Chicago, actually. Chicago is a Native American word that means field of wild onions. And it is in the Newberry Library in Chicago if you wanted to see it. Here is the Spanish translation of the Popol Vuh. You have the Roman translation here, and then he translated into our Popol Vuh there, and that's how it made it all the way to 1857 in Vienna. All right. And again, this is the one we're going to stop on now as we transition to understanding the astronomical value of the text before we even start reading it. This here is a hieroglyphic representation of the movements of Venus. So this here shows the incredible importance that existed for the planet Venus in the Mayan calendar, Mayan concepts of time, Mayan holy days, etc. Okay, the left-hand column here describes the movements of Venus during one of the 5 different types of cycles, and then the right hand here it has the auguries for the cycle. Okay, and so again, auguries are predictive symbols. So this is how the cycle will tell the future, essentially, and this is the cycle itself. So you can read it as a sort of plaque that is telling the future, essentially, or telling you how to read the cycles of Venus in order to predict future events. So it is essentially instructions for telling the future. in its way, which makes it really fascinating. In the top picture you see here, that is Hunahpu, and then the middle picture here, that is the god who stands for Venus, and the bottom picture is a victim who is being hit by the dart of the Venus god. So the god of Venus is hitting his victim, and you can see how this dart is entering his shield. So you have Venus, the shield, and this is Hunahpu. Okay. So this again is an important little piece of that history. Now we'll go on to this section here. And this is all about that foresight that I was speaking of. I'll read this. They knew whether war would occur. Everything they saw was clear to them, whether there would be death, or whether there would be famine, or whether quarrels would occur. They knew it for certain, since there was a place to see it. There was a book. Council book was their name for it. Okay? So here is this kind of section that leads us to see how this was the book that would allow leaders who could read it to see into the future, to understand why things happen and when they do, and when they will happen. All right. So here is what it is. The Popol Vuh contains a systematic account of cycles in astronomical and earthly events. And cycles is important, right? Because we talk so much about our myopia being caused by our linear concept of time. And when we study ancient American cultures from the American continents, oftentimes we'll focus on what's called spiralic time or spiralic time, which is the understanding of time as being a spiral and not a line. So there's this kind of collision between the linear and the spiralic or spiralic that occurs when colonialism arrives on the banks of these indigenous tribes. Okay, so you have the linear colliding with the spiralic, and that's what we have here with Cortez arriving in the Central American or in Guatemala and encountering the Mayan people who believed in these cycles, right? And so if something is a cycle, then we know it repeats, and so you would be able to, let me erase what I've written over the words. You would be able to tell the future if you were to perceive time as a spiral, right? You would be able to see it. That makes sense. So there is immense value in the spiralic time, and it also makes sense that hieroglyphics would be the language of a spiralic time, because pictures, they're not so married to their definitions as phonetic symbols, as Roman words. We are focused so much on definition. This much is much more figurative, and I think that cycles lends itself to the figurative rather than the literal, to an extent. And when you think figuratively, that is when you really do get to see how cycles occur. But that's a little bit esoteric. So let's stop talking about that. All right. So again, I'll read it again. If the ancient Popol Vuh was like the surviving hieroglyphic books, it contains systematic accounts of cycles in astronomical and earthly events that served as a complex navigation system for those who wish to see and move beyond the present. I love that phrase because it imagines time like a sea, if we can think about a sea. And we think about navigation as being a kind of a boat or a ship that navigates by the stars or by this astronomy. And so we are on an ocean of time, essentially, and we can navigate that ocean of time by simply looking up. It's that simple, and yet it's something we so rarely do. Or, as I spoke of in the beginning, it's something that is resigned for a select few scientists who can actually understand and interpret our modern technology. Anyway, there you go. So, let's move on to thinking about the planet Venus. Okay, so we're actually going to switch books now. I'm going to put this one away. And we're going to the Illustrated Dictionary of the Gods of the Mayan people and of ancient Mexico. It's a nice illustrated dictionary, as you can see, with depictions of these hieroglyphics. But we're going to go specifically to the passage dedicated to Venus. And I will flip through this book in more detail later. Right now, I just want to focus on how Venus worked. Because, of course, their calendar is largely based on Venus. Okay, so here we are thinking about Venus, the primary planet of the Popol Vuh. Okay, so in this book, we have the same panel from the Dresden Cortex that I'm going to show you in a second. You'll see here, just like we looked before, this guy, the god of Venus, is very angry and violent, right? He looks scary. And that's because the god of Venus was not it was a portent of something bad coming, not something good. It's a way to predict what terrible things will happen, not what good things will happen. And these terrible events were often associated with sickness, famine, but also, most importantly, war. And these council members would schedule wars based on their understanding of Venus's kind of course through the sky. So we'll start here. Okay. They recognized instantly that as the brightest star, it had two distinct phases. So the two kind of forms that Venus takes were not separate stars, but rather one. And they noticed that. That of the morning and the evening star. Okay? It's a single heavenly body. When Venus arises as the morning star, it appears before sunrise and leads the sun out of the underworld. When Venus rises as the evening star, it comes into view just after the sunset and follows the sun into the underworld. So already it holds a sort of paradoxical position as the thing that brings us out of the underworld, but also the thing that brings us to the underworld. So as a planet, it's a very complex one in its role, right? And that brings me here to this paradox present here, which is, according to the Florentine Codex, the influence of Venus could be good or evil. But the instructions for dealing with it reveal that most people perceived it to be the source of dangerous rays. Those afraid of its pernicious light sealed any openings in their houses, lest it bring on sickness and misfortune. So this returns us, right, to the initial understanding of the text. It's very confusing, paradoxical title, which is what comes from, essentially, we can write beside the sea. So the light that comes from beside the sea, but also the title that suggested it comes from what hides in the shadows, right? We have those two very different names for the Popol Vuh, and both are existing simultaneously. So there's this fear, this celebration of light, but also the fear of it, and perhaps is the light's association with the underworld. So in this case, people were actually sealing up their houses afraid, essentially, of starlight. Right, afraid of the light that shows at night, because allegedly it would bring bad things. So while we love the light during the day, it seems the light at night was a dangerous force, a dangerous god, essentially. Okay, so here there's a great deal of information about how the Venus's path is charted. I won't go into it because it's very convoluted. But I'll go here now to Star Wars. Nothing to do with the George Lucas Star Wars, but interesting in that all of these books that charted the path of Venus, okay, and created this Venus, the calendar of Venus, which was Mayan, is that they would record wars that were timed to coincide with the movements of Venus. Okay, so wars were actually scheduled according to the movements of Venus. So they were scheduled to occur on the days when Venus rose for the first time. And Mayan astronomers would chart the maximum brightness and greatest elongation of both morning and evening star to time their battles. And I assume, right, when we think about the Venus's light, right, the power of Venus's light, that has some relationship with this idea that the light brought with it terrible things. So they would time these events for those the periods when that light was at its greatest. So this book suggests that these increasing frequency of these wars contributed to the collapse of the classic Mayan before the arrival of Cortez. But this is the thing that we see related to Venus is war and the planning of wars. And so that prescience that we're speaking of seems to be highly focused on war. When do we plan wars? When do we go to war? When do we fight against one another? What is the best time for these kinds of antagonistic events? Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is associated with war, and it is the jaguar god. And the reason I want to speak of this is because it's almost disappointing to me that so much of that prescience of the text is based on violence and power. But it makes sense. I think if we could see the future, it is most likely that we would use it for the purposes of violence and power. And so in that way, it is a very predicting text, because when we do encounter technology or we do improve with things like AI, what do we use it for? Violence and power. And so the fact that this technology, this predictive technology that the Popol Vuh would have represented, it was related to power, is not at all surprising, I suppose. This is the creature of war. I'm going to show you what he looks like in a sec. He's on this page. The jaguar, right? The jaguar is the powerful creature. And this is the creature that represents war in the Mayan culture, right? There is our jaguar, the hill of the jaguar, right? And here he is, a jaguar in a state of transformation. Our human to jaguar, jaguar to human, where you would want to take on the powerful qualities of the jaguar in your own form. But we have here again the jaguar serpent bird, who's rather disturbing. He is the version of the war serpent. So here, as we speak of war that was planned in Venus and the cruel figure of Venus, we have also the cruel figure of war. Again, the jaguar serpent bird. Serpents would birth through their mouths, would birth gods and nobles. Like they would almost vomit them up, because we know snakes that kind of regurgitate what they eat. That's how they expel waste. So when we think of a serpent bird, they are expelling from their mouths gods, nobles, kind of vomiting up life, which is a very dark way to think about life coming about. But this is the jaguar serpent bird, the kind of creature of war. But the jaguar god you'll see here is associated with the underworld, the jaguar god of the underworld. And if we remember, Venus was pulling us to and from the underworld every day, or and in its cycles, it would pull us to the underworld and from the underworld. So the jaguar, being one of the most important animals, is no coincidence. Okay? So we'll see here, probably the most feared and revered beast in Mesoamerica, the jaguar played a prominent religious role. Like humankind, the jaguar occupies the top level of the food chain, and people sought to identify themselves with the big cat. Generally nocturnal, and again we see that emphasis on night. The eyes are the luminous gold discs. So the eyes are like stars in the world, is how we might perceive that. And so we're seeing the jaguar as a kind of celestial being in that its eyes work as a star in the night. So you're seeing that connection between the jaguar and Venus already. A jaguar skull excavated at Kaminalaju, I don't know, bears gold pyrite eyes. Distinctive black rosettes characterize jaguar pelage, and they are present even on the rarer all-black jaguar, although they can be seen only in raking light. Fascinating how the jaguar represents both darkness and light. We are again seeing that binary opposition. Now here is when we see the true use of the jaguar was to assert lordly power. They would wear jaguar pelts, jaguar sandals, headdresses fashioned of jaguar heads, and necklaces made of jaguar teeth. Okay, they were the symbol of the enthroned lord, and many stone thrones, particularly among the Maya, took the shape of jaguars, sometimes double-headed. Okay, so we end there with the jaguar, who again is like a star on land because of its bright eyes that reflect light. And we'll again look. Oh, this is a sacrifice jaguar. Look at that. That's the remains of a jaguar that was left as an offering. Really interesting. And here, right, on this image of the jaguar serpent bird as our final just image before we go. But we've heard from Venus a kind of frightening light that one's house had to be sealed up from because the light could cause sickness and death. And we see how the leaders would look into the Popol Vuh, and they would look into the tracings of Venus in order to determine when wars would be fought. And then we see again the powerful jaguar being the essence of blackness, right, of darkness, but having eyes that could reflect the light, that could shine, right, a kind of powerful light, much like the light of Venus in the night, a very frightening creature. And in this creature, when joined with a serpent, would be a kind of creator as well, as the serpent creates. It's a powerful serpent creator. All right? So that's that. That is, I'm going to turn it around and say goodbye. So let me just go ahead and do that. It's all about Venus and its importance in Mayan culture, or a slim part of its importance. Of course, there's so much more to it, and that book is so long, so I'm going to go through it and find some passages that we can talk about for another video. But for now, I hope you have a wonderful night or day or wherever it is you're going next, and thank you so much for joining me. Bye everyone.